The year is 1887, deep within the shadowed hollows of the Missouri Ozarks, where the limestone bluffs weep with spring water and the fog clings to the valleys like a shroud. A boy named Finn is fishing. He isn't supposed to be this far down Black Creek, not this close to the bend where the water slows to a murky crawl. This stretch of the river belongs to the widow, Elara Heston, and the town of Hemlock Hollow has learned to give her land a wide and fearful berth. But the fish are biting here, and Finn is young enough that curiosity still outweighs caution. He casts his line into the placid water, the silence broken only by the drone of cicadas and the gentle lapping of the current against the muddy bank. His hook snags on something heavy, something stubbornly lodged in the silt. It's not a log. It doesn't have the dead weight of a rock. He pulls, his thin arms straining. The object gives way with a soft, sucking sound, and he reels it in. What emerges from the murky depths is not a fish, nor a tangle of roots. It is a piece of bone, unnaturally white against the dark mud. It's large, curved, and heavier than it looks. But what makes Finn drop his fishing pole and stumble backward in silent terror is not its size or its shape. It's the texture. The surface is strangely smooth in some places, yet pitted and scored in others, as if it had been scraped clean. And at one end, a network of hairline fractures suggests it was subjected to an intense, blistering heat. It looks, to his horrified and uncomprehending eyes, like it has been cooked, like it has been boiled. He is miles from anyone who can hear him scream, standing on the edge of a forbidden property, holding a fragment of a horrifying, unspeakable secret. The bone Finn discovered was a piece of a human femur. An official examination would later confirm this, though no official examination would ever be publicly recorded. In the Ozarks of the late 19th century, justice was a different creature, more myth than process. The law was a distant echo from St. Louis, and in places like Hemlock Hollow, it was the whispers of the community, the weight of superstition, and the authority of the local marshal that truly governed the souls living there. Before the bone, there were the disappearances. They happened slowly at first over the course of 2 years. A lone prospector heading west, a traveling peddler with a cart of cheap tinware, a railroad surveyor charting a new path through the unforgiving hills. These were transient men, men without local roots, whose absence wouldn't be noted for weeks, if ever. They were ghosts on the national landscape, their lives as thin and easily torn as paper. They would pass through Hemlock Hollow, perhaps stopping at the general store for supplies, and then venture on, their path taking them along the winding dirt track that followed Black Creek. And then they would simply vanish. The Ozark wilderness was a vast, hungry entity. It swallowed people whole. A man could fall into a ravine, be taken by a panther, or simply lose his way in the dense, disorienting woods. These were the accepted explanations. They were easy, comfortable theories that kept the darkness at bay. But a darker rumor had begun to fester in the town's collective mind. A story told in hushed tones around potbelly stoves. A forbidden narrative that centered on the isolated cabin that sat brooding over the creek, and the solitary woman who lived within it. Her name was Elara Heston. She had arrived in Hemlock Hollow 7 years prior with her husband, a stern, barrel-chested man named Jebediah. They were outsiders, and the Ozarks have always been wary of outsiders. They bought the old Miller plot, a secluded piece of land nobody wanted, shadowed by a dark ridge and bordered by the deepest part of the creek. The locals watched them with suspicion. Jebediah was a hard drinker with a violent temper, and the sounds of his rage often carried on the night air. Elara was quiet, spectral. She was seen only on rare trips to the general store, a tall, gaunt figure with eyes that seemed to hold a permanent, deep-seated sorrow. She never spoke unless spoken to, her voice a low, melodic whisper that was somehow more unsettling than a shout. Then, 2 years ago, the fire. It happened on a moonless autumn night. The Heston cabin went up in a furious blaze, lighting the hollow with a demonic orange glow. By the time the townsfolk arrived, it was too late. The cabin was a skeleton of charred timbers. They found Elara sitting by the creek, wrapped in a blanket, watching the embers die. She claimed Jebediah had been inside, trapped. They found what was left of him, but there wasn't much. The fire had been unnaturally intense. Ilara rebuilt the cabin herself, timber by timber, with a strength that seemed impossible for her slender frame. And she stayed. Now a widow, her isolation became absolute. She became a fixture of the landscape, as much a part of the Hollow's macabre tapes. Try as the skeletal winter oaks and the mournful cry of the whippoorwill. The town's suspicion, once a low murmur, began to curdle into something far more sinister. The disappearances began 6 months after the fire. The first was a man named Silas Croft, a tinker who traveled the Ozark trails sharpening knives and mending pots. He was last seen leaving Hemlock Hollow, heading north along the Creek Road, the same road that passed directly by Ilara Heston's isolated property. His horse and cart were found a week later, miles away, the horse grazing peacefully. Of Silas, there was no trace. The local marshal, a weary man named Bo Sutton, conducted a half-hearted search. He concluded Croft had likely met with foul play at the hands of bandits or had simply abandoned his trade. The case went cold, another forgotten soul claimed by the wilderness. But the people of Hemlock Hollow had a different theory. They spoke of the widow. They noted how she never seemed to want for anything, despite having no visible source of income. They whispered about the strange, sweet-smelling smoke that sometimes drifted from her chimney, a smoke that didn't smell like burning oak or hickory. It was thicker, greasier, and carried a scent that turned the stomach. They called her the Witch of Black Creek. Children were warned not to go near her land, lest she snatch them for her pot. Travelers were advised to take the long way around, to avoid the stretch of road that ran under the shadow of her cabin. These were just stories, of course. The dark folklore of an isolated, superstitious community. But as more men vanished, the folklore began to feel disturbingly like fact. The fear was a living thing, a creeping vine that was slowly choking the hollow. And at the center of it all was the silent, watchful figure of the widow, a woman whose grief seemed to have been replaced by something cold, something patient, something utterly terrifying. The discovery of the boiled bone by young Finn shattered the town's fragile peace. The story spread like wildfire, a spark of truth in a forest of rumor. What was once whispered in taverns was now spoken of openly in the churchyard. The bone was passed from hand to nervous hand, a holy and horrifying relic. It was proof. It was the physical manifestation of all their darkest fears. The town marshal, Bo Sutton, could no longer dismiss the vanishings as accidents or banditry. The evidence, however gruesome and strange, was irrefutable. A piece of a man, cooked and discarded in the creek just downstream from the widow's cabin. The connection was impossible to ignore. Yet Sutton was a man of the law, however tenuous that law was in the Ozarks. He couldn't simply march to Ilara Heston's door with a mob at his back. He needed more than superstition and a single, macabre artifact. He needed a case. And so he began to dig, not into the earth but into the past. He started with the fire that had claimed Ilara's husband. At the time, it had been ruled a tragic accident, a drunken stupor and a knocked-over lantern. But now Sutton questioned that conclusion. He spoke to the men who had been there that night. They recalled the ferocity of the blaze, how it had consumed the dry timber with an almost sentient hunger. One man remembered the smell, not just of burning wood but of something else. Kerosene. A detail that had been overlooked, dismissed in the chaos of the night. It was a small thing, a single loose thread, but as Sutton pulled on it, the entire narrative of Ilara Heston, the grieving widow, began to unravel. The image of a victim was fading, replaced by the chilling silhouette of something else entirely. Marshal Sutton's investigation took him back to the very beginning, to the day the Hestons arrived in Hemlock Hollow. He learned they had come from the east, from the smog-choked cities of the Rust Belt, seeking a different life. But they had brought their darkness with them. Jebediah was known to have been a cruel man, not just a drinker but a brute who took pleasure in the fear of others. Sutton uncovered quiet records of complaints filed against him in their previous town: assault, public drunkenness, domestic disturbances. Ilara, it seemed, had been his favorite victim. Her silence in Hemlock Hollow was not the quiet of a peaceful soul but the learned silence of the terrorized. This discovery painted the fire in a new, disturbing light. Was it an accident, or was it an act of desperation? An escape? For the first time, a flicker of sympathy entered the marshal's heart. He imagined the years of torment she must have endured, but that sympathy was quickly extinguished by a far colder thought. If she was capable of killing her husband to escape a life of misery, what else was she capable of? Was it possible that the act of killing, born of desperation, had awoken something else within her? A dormant appetite for control, for power, for a gruesome and final form of justice against the kind of N who had wronged her. The marshal felt a chill crawl up his spine. The disappearances, the vanished strangers, they were all men. Lone travelers, vulnerable, easy targets. Men who, in Alara's fractured mind, might have borne a resemblance to the monster she had married. The theory was monstrous, almost unthinkable. But in the grim reality of the Ozark Hills, the unthinkable was often the truth. The mystery of Alara Heston has been deliberately obscured, almost completely erased from the formal historical record. What we are piecing together now comes from fragmented sources, a few surviving lines in a county clerk's private journal, transcriptions of oral histories collected decades later, and the powerful, enduring folklore of the region. These accounts are often contradictory, colored by the terror of the time. They are the forbidden history of a place that tried to forget. According to these whispers, Marshal Sutton decided he needed to see Alara's property for himself. He couldn't go with a warrant. He had no concrete proof, only a growing mountain of terrifying suspicion. So he went under the guise of a routine inquiry, a friendly check-in on a solitary member of his community. He rode out to the rebuilt cabin one crisp autumn afternoon, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The cabin was small but meticulously kept. A neat stack of firewood rested against the wall, and rows of late-season vegetables grew in a tilled garden. There was a profound and unsettling stillness to the place. As he approached, Alara emerged from the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron. She was as the townspeople described her, tall, gaunt, with eyes like chips of flint. She showed no surprise, no fear. She simply watched him, her expression a blank mask. Sutton, a man accustomed to the bluster of criminals and the tears of victims, found himself unnerved by her utter calm. It was the calm of a deep, cold lake. You could see the surface, but you had no idea what horrifying depths lay beneath. If you find these kinds of suppressed, macabre histories as fascinating as I do, consider subscribing to the channel. The stories that have been banned are often the ones that tell us the most about the darkness human nature is capable of. And the full story of Alara Heston is one of the most disturbing you will ever hear. Marshal Sutton began with simple questions. He asked about her well-being, the harshness of the coming winter, the state of her small garden. Alara answered in clipped, single-word responses, her voice a low rustle like dry leaves. Her gaze never wavered from his. The marshal's eyes, however, were scanning everything. He noted the strange absence of personal effects, the Spartan cleanliness of the cabin's exterior. Then his gaze fell upon something by the side of the cabin, partially hidden by a canvas tarp. It was a massive iron pot, far larger than any single woman would need for cooking or washing. It was a rendering cauldron, the kind used for processing lard from a whole hog or for boiling lye to make soap on an industrial scale. It was large enough to fit a grown man. When Sutton asked about it, a flicker of something, annoyance, caution, crossed her features for the first time. She claimed it was for making soap, which she sold in towns further down the river. It was a plausible explanation. Many rural women supplemented their income this way. But the size of it, it was excessive, disturbingly so. And then Sutton noticed the ground around the cauldron. The earth was dark and stained, and the grass refused to grow in a wide circle around its base, as if the soil itself had been poisoned by whatever had been repeatedly boiled within. A foul, cloying odor, faint but unmistakable, hung in the air. It was the smell of old grease and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet, the smell of death. Sutton kept his face impassive, thanked her for her time, and tipped his hat. As he rode away, he did not look back, but he could feel her eyes on him, cold and calculating. The friendly inquiry was over. The hunt had begun. The cauldron was the turning point for Marshall Sutton. It was a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit the picture of a simple, grieving widow. It suggested a process, a macabre industry. His mind kept returning to the boiled bone found in the creek. The connection was terrifyingly clear. He now believed with a certainty that chilled him to his core that Alara Heston was not just a killer. She was processing her victims. The thought was so grotesque it bordered on the absurd, but every clue pointed in its direction. The sweet, greasy smoke from her chimney, the stained, barren earth around the giant pot, the disappearances of lone male travelers. Sutton realized he was dealing with a kind of monster he had no name for. This wasn't a crime of passion or greed in the traditional sense. It was something methodical, something ritualistic. He spent the next several days in Turv, viewing everyone in Hemlock Hollow again, this time with a new, desperate focus. He wasn't just asking if they had seen the missing men. He was asking about Alara's comings and goings. Had anyone seen her transport goods? Had she ever been seen with large crates or barrels? A stable boy at the livery finally gave him something. He remembered seeing the widow, a few times a year, loading plain wooden boxes onto a small cart late at night. She always took the old eastern road, the one that led towards the more populated towns along the railroad line. The boy assumed it was soap, as she claimed, but he did mention one strange detail. The boxes, he said, were unusually heavy for their size, and they were always sealed tight as if their contents were precious or needed to be hidden. The detail about the heavy, sealed boxes sent Marshall Sutton on a 100-mile journey east to the bustling railroad town of Springfield. If Alara was selling a product, this is where she would find her market. He spent 2 days showing a daguerreotype of the widow to shopkeepers and merchants. Most didn't recognize her. In a town full of strangers, a quiet woman from the hills would hardly stand out. He was about to give up when he found him, an old apothecary owner named Alastair Finch. Finch not only recognized the woman in the photograph, he was one of her regular customers. He knew her not as Alara Heston but by a different name she had given him, and he confirmed that she sold him soap. But it wasn't just any soap. It was, in Finch's words, the finest soap he had ever come across. It was a hard, pale, almost luminous bar that produced a rich, creamy lather and had a faint, unique scent he couldn't quite identify. It was incredibly popular, especially with the ladies of the town, who claimed it left their skin feeling softer and more supple than anything else. He bought every bar she could make, selling it at a premium under his own brand name, Miracle Balm Soap. He told the marshal he had customers who would buy it by the case. The apothecary owner was proud of his discovery, completely oblivious to the horrifying nature of his business relationship. He even showed Sutton his last remaining crate, waiting to be unpacked. The marshal stared at the plain, heavy wooden box, sealed just as the stable boy had described. He was standing in a respectable shop, in a civilized town, looking at the final, sanitized product of an unspeakable, macabre production line that began with murder in a lonely Ozark hollow. Marshal Sutton knew he couldn't simply confiscate the crate of soap. He had no authority in Springfield, and his story would have sounded like the ravings of a madman. How could he explain that he believed the town's most popular luxury good was rendered from the fat of missing persons? The very idea was a Gothic nightmare, not a matter for rational law enforcement. He needed undeniable proof, something that would leave no room for doubt or dismissal. He thanked the apothecary for his time and rode back to Hemlock Hollow, his mind racing. The entire horrifying picture was now assembled in his head. Alara wasn't just a killer driven by revenge. She was a grotesque artisan. She had turned murder into a cottage industry. The strangers who passed her cabin were not just victims, they were raw materials. She would lure them in, perhaps with the promise of a hot meal or a place to rest for the night. Once they were inside, she would kill them. Then the truly disturbing work would begin. The giant cauldron, the rendering process, boiling the bodies down to their constituent parts. She would separate the fat, the raw ingredient for her Miracle Balm soap. The bones, scraped clean, would be discarded in the creek. The rest of the remains, Sutton didn't want to imagine. It was a perfect, self-sustaining system of horror. The murders provided the materials for a product, and the sale of that product provided the income that allowed her to live her isolated life, waiting for the next victim to wander down her road. Upon his return to Hemlock Hollow, Marshal Sutton found the town gripped by a new wave of fear. Another man had vanished. His name was Elias Thorne, a land surveyor from back east. He was different from the others. He wasn't a drifter. He was a professional with a company expecting his reports. His disappearance would not go unnoticed. He was last seen by a farmer just a few miles from Alara Heston's property, asking for directions to Black Creek. The news hit Sutton like a physical blow. He had been gone for days, and in his absence the monster had claimed another victim. The time for quiet investigation was over. The guilt and urgency propelled him into action. He now had a fresh crime, a timeline, and a victim whose absence would trigger a serious external inquiry. He could finally get the warrant he needed. He rode to the nearest county seat, a full day's journey, and laid out his case to a skeptical circuit judge. He told him about the disappearances, the rumors, the boiled bone, the giant cauldron, and the apothecary in Springfield. The judge listened, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. It was the surveyor, Elias Thorne, that sealed it. The disappearance of a man with connections, a man who would be missed by powerful people, transformed the case from Ozark folklore into a matter of state importance. The judge, his hand trembling slightly, signed the warrant. Sutton now had the legal authority to search every inch of Alara Heston's property, to dig up her garden, and to break down her door if necessary. He was going back to the cabin on Black Creek, and this time he would not be leaving with unanswered questions. Marshal Sutton assembled a posse of 5 men from the town. He chose them carefully, not the hotheads who wanted vigilante justice, but steady, sober men who could be relied upon to follow orders and not lose their nerve. As they rode towards Alara's property in the gray light of dawn, a heavy silence hung over the group. The bravado had evaporated, replaced by a grim, stomach-churning anxiety. They all knew, deep down, that they were not just serving a warrant. They were confronting a living nightmare, stepping into the heart of the darkness that had haunted their town for 2 long years. When they arrived, the cabin was just as Sutton had last seen it, quiet, neat, and unnervingly peaceful. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sign of life within. Sutton and 2 men approached the front door while the other 3 began to circle the property, their rifles held at the ready. Sutton knocked, his knuckles rapping against the rough-hewn wood. The sound was swallowed by the immense silence of the hollow. He knocked again, louder this time, announcing his presence and the warrant. There was no reply. After a third knock went unanswered, he gave the signal. One of the men, a burly blacksmith, put his shoulder to the door. It splintered and burst inward, revealing the cabin's dark interior. The air that rushed out was cold and stale, carrying a faint, antiseptic smell of lye and something else. The same cloying, sweet odor from the cauldron, but stronger here, embedded in the very walls of the house. The monster wasn't home. The inside of the cabin was even more disturbing than its placid exterior. It was obsessively clean, the wooden floors scrubbed nearly white. A simple cot sat in one corner, a small table and chair in another. There were no books, no decorations, no personal items of any kind. It was less a home than a sterile workspace. The only objects of note were on a set of shelves against the far wall. Here, laid out in a neat row, were nearly a dozen men's hats. There was a prospector's felt hat, a gentleman's bowler, a surveyor's wide-brimmed cap. They were trophies. A cold, methodical collection cataloging her victims. Beneath the hats, the men found something even more chilling. Several large sacks filled with men's clothing, all sizes, all styles. Some of it was worn and patched, the clothes of laborers. Some was fine wool, the attire of a man of means. It had all been carefully washed and folded as if being prepared for sale. Alara, it seemed, wasted nothing. But it was in the main fireplace, swept clean of ash, that they made their most horrifying discovery so far. Lodged deep within the mortar between the stones, they found them, human teeth. Dozens of them pushed into the cracks like tiny white pegs. molars, incisors, canines. They were a grim, silent testament to the gruesome process that took place here, small, indestructible fragments of the men who had been consumed by the house. The posse stood in stunned silence, the sheer, calculated horror of the scene washing over them. This was not the lair of a madwoman. It was the meticulously organized abattoir of a predator. While the men searched the cabin, Marshal Sutton's attention was drawn to the small, tilled garden outside. It looked ordinary enough with rows of withered cornstalks and frostbitten squash vines. But something was wrong. The soil was too dark, too rich, and it seemed to have been recently turned over in several places. He remembered the stained earth around the cauldron and felt a surge of cold dread. He called over the blacksmith, a man whose arms were thick with muscle from swinging a sledgehammer. "Dig here," Sutton commanded, pointing to a patch of earth near the back of the garden. The blacksmith plunged his shovel into the soft loam. On the third scoop, the shovel struck something with a dull, heavy thud. It wasn't a rock. The man knelt and scraped away the dirt with his hands. He recoiled as if stung. Lying in the shallow grave was a human hand, the flesh pale and bloated, but remarkably well preserved by the cold autumn soil. It was the hand of the surveyor, Elias Thorne. He had been buried for only a few days. The discovery galvanized the posse. They grabbed shovels and picks and began to dig with a feverish intensity, turning the entire garden plot into a chaotic excavation site. And with every shovel full of earth, the true, mind-shattering scale of Alara Heston's crimes was unearthed. Her garden was a cemetery. They found another body, then another. Some were little more than skeletons, the bones tangled together in shallow graves. Others were more recent, the process of decay still underway. It was a bone garden, a place where the widow had planted the men she had harvested. The digging continued for hours, a grim and silent task under the watchful eyes of the Ozark Hills. By midday, they had unearthed the remains of 7 different men from the small garden plot. The horror was numbing, overwhelming. The men worked mechanically, their faces pale masks of shock. Each discovery was a fresh wave of revulsion. They found the tinker, Silas Croft, identified by a distinctive belt buckle. They found a young man whose pockets still contained a letter from his mother. They found the skeletal remains of men who must have been among her first victims after her husband's death. But Marshal Sutton knew this wasn't all of them. The stories, the rumors, the sheer number of hats in the cabin, it all pointed to more. Many more. Where were the others? His eyes were drawn back to the creek, the slow-moving, murky water that bordered the property. The same creek where young Finn had found the first boiled bone. He realized the garden was only for the recent victims, the ones she hadn't had time to fully process. The creek was her primary dumping ground. For 2 years, Alara Heston had been systematically discarding the skeletal remains of her victims into the water, letting the current carry away the evidence of her horrifying work, piece by piece. The true number of men she had murdered would never be known. They were scattered for miles downriver, buried in the silt, a permanent and terrifying secret held by the landscape itself. These kinds of forbidden histories, buried by time and fear, are a stark reminder of the darkness that can fester in isolated places. If you believe these stories need to be told, help our channel grow by hitting the like button and sharing this documentary with someone who appreciates the macabre side of history. As the sun began to set, casting long, sinister shadows across the desecrated garden, the question remained, where was Alara? The cabin was empty, her cart and mule were gone. She had vanished as completely as her victims. Had she been warned? Did she sense the law closing in? Marshal Sutton dispatched 2 of his men to ride back to Hemlock Hollow and organize a wider search party. He and the others would remain on the property, standing vigil over the dead. As night fell, a deep, oppressive quiet settled over the hollow. The men built a fire not for warmth, but to ward off the encroaching darkness and the profound sense of evil that seemed to emanate from the very soil beneath their feet. They didn't speak. What was there to say? They were sitting in the middle of a mass grave, a human slaughterhouse disguised as a quaint homestead. Sutton stared into the flames, his mind replaying every detail of the case. He thought of Alara's cold, empty eyes, her unnerving calm. He tried to understand the psychology of such a monster. Was it born from the abuse she suffered, a twisted act of revenge that had spiraled into a gruesome obsession? Or was the darkness already inside her, merely waiting for a catalyst, like the fire that had freed her from her husband, to be unleashed upon the world? He found no easy answers. The fire offered no comfort, only flickering light on the faces of haunted men. They were waiting for a monster to return to her lair, but as the hours crawled by, a new, more disturbing possibility began to dawn on them. Perhaps she wasn't coming back. Perhaps she was already far away, moving towards a new town, a new isolated property, ready to begin her horrifying work all over again. The search for Elira Heston became the largest manhunt in the region's history. Word of the Bone Garden of Hemlock Hollow spread through the Ozarks, mutating with each telling into a legend of almost supernatural horror. She was no longer just a murderous widow. She was a demon, a ghoul who feasted on the flesh of men. Posses scoured the hills, checking every abandoned cabin and remote settlement. Bounties were posted in towns from Missouri to Arkansas, but Elira was a ghost. She knew the wilderness, she knew how to live off the land, and she knew how to disappear. The weeks turned into months, and the trail went cold. She had seemingly been swallowed by the very wilderness that had served as her hunting ground. Back in Hemlock Hollow, the community struggled to cope with the aftermath. The bodies from the garden were given a proper burial in the churchyard, a mass funeral attended by the entire town. The cabin on Black Creek was burned to the ground by the townspeople in a catha. Arctic act of purification, its ashes scattered to the winds. They wanted to erase every trace of her existence, to cleanse the land of her stain. But it wasn't that simple. The horror had seeped into the collective consciousness of the town. The creek was now believed to be cursed, its waters forever tainted. The land where her cabin once stood became a shunned, forbidden place. The story of the widow who boiled strangers alive became a cautionary tale, a brutal piece of folklore used to frighten children and warn travelers, a permanent scar on the soul of the community. What of the soap, the miracle balm from Springfield? When Marshall Sutton returned with the full, horrifying truth, the apothecary Alastair Finch was overcome with revulsion. The news spread through the high society of the city, causing a wave of sickness and hysteria. Women who had praised the soap for its luxurious qualities, who had used it on their skin, on their children, were now consumed with a visceral horror. They scrubbed themselves raw, trying to wash away the psychological and physical stain. The entire remaining stock was gathered and publicly burned in a massive bonfire in the town square, the foul-smelling smoke a testament to its grotesque origin. This single act reveals the true, horrifying reach of Elira Heston's crimes. Her evil was not contained to the remote hollow where she lived. It had been packaged, commodified, and sold. It had infiltrated the homes of the wealthy and respectable, a macabre secret hiding in plain sight on their washstands. This detail is often left out of the more sanitized versions of the legend, yet it is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. It demonstrates a level of cunning and detachment that is truly psychopathic. Elira Heston was not just a murderer. She was a businesswoman, and her business was death. She had found a way to make her pathology profitable, to turn the remnants of her victims into a luxury good, a final, horrifying insult to the men she had destroyed. The very concept is so vile. It was deemed too disturbing for official records, contributing to why this entire case was effectively banned from mainstream history. The official case file on the Hemlock Hollow murders is curiously thin. It documents the discovery of the bodies, lists the names of the identified victims, and notes that the primary suspect, Elira Heston, fled before she could be apprehended and was never found. There is no mention of the cauldron, the rendering of fat, or the soap. There is no mention of cannibalism or the macabre trophies found in her cabin. The official narrative was deliberately sanitized. Why? In the late 19th century, the idea of a female serial killer was virtually unheard of. Women were seen as victims of violence, not perpetrators of it on this scale. The grotesque, industrial nature of Elira's crimes was so far outside the realm of comprehension, so deeply threatening to the social and moral order of the time that the authorities chose to suppress the most disturbing details. They presented it as a simple case of murder and flight, not the story of a human monster who turned men into a commercial product. This act of censorship is why the story of Alara Heston faded from official history and survived only as a dark, fragmented piece of folklore. It was deemed too macabre, too shameful, too fundamentally disturbing to be preserved in the annals of formal crime. The truth was banned, buried under a simpler, less challenging narrative. But folklore has a long memory. The whispers, the stories passed down through generations, kept the horrifying truth alive, a forbidden history waiting to be unearthed. The story serves as a chilling example of how the official record can be a curated version of the past, with the most unsettling truths intentionally left in the dark. One of the most enduring and creepy mysteries within the larger case is the question of how Alara managed to overpower her victims. She was described as tall but gaunt, while many of the men who vanished were strong, able-bodied laborers and prospectors. How could a lone woman subdue and murder so many men without a struggle being heard, without any signs of a fight being found? The folklore of the region offers a supernatural explanation, that she was a witch who used charms and spells to lure men to their doom. But the reality is likely far more sinister and rooted in human psychology and physiology. Marshall Sutton, in his private journal, speculated on this very question. He noted that Alara was known to be a skilled herbalist, a common practice in the isolated Ozarks where doctors were scarce. She gathered plants from the surrounding woods, and the townspeople occasionally and reluctantly sought her out for remedies for minor ailments. Sutton came to believe that she used her knowledge not for healing, but for murder. He theorized that she would invite the weary travelers into her cabin, offering them a hoe, tea meal, or a warm drink laced with a powerful sedative. She likely used plants native to the region, such as datura, also known as jimsonweed, or even extracts from certain mushrooms. These substances could induce a state of paralysis, confusion, or unconsciousness, rendering a strong man completely helpless. He would become docile, easily led, and ultimately unable to resist as she committed her horrifying acts. This method would explain the lack of struggle, the silence, and the clinical precision of her crimes. This theory of poison or sedatives adds another layer of calculated cruelty to Alara's methodology. It meant that her victims were not killed in a moment of passionate rage. Their deaths were a slow, deliberate process. She would have to sit with them, perhaps even converse with them, as the drug took hold. She would watch as their strength failed them, as their awareness faded, as they became utterly vulnerable. This proximity to her victims, this cold, patient observation of their descent into helplessness, speaks to a level of psychological detachment that is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine the final moments of these men. They would have felt a sense of relief, having found a safe harbor on their long journey. They would have accepted the hospitality of a seemingly harmless widow, suspecting nothing. Then, a strange drowsiness, a confusion. The world around them would begin to swim and blur. Their limbs would feel heavy, unresponsive. And through this haze of poison, they would see the woman's face, her expression changing from one of quiet solicitude to one of cold, predatory intent. The last thing they would have known was not a sudden, violent blow, but the slow, creeping terror of paralysis, and the horrifying realization that the kind woman who had offered them shelter was, in fact, the monster they should have been running from all along. The ultimate betrayal, delivered with a cup of tea. It is a detail that makes the story not just macabre, but deeply, psychologically terrifying. What became of Alara Heston? This is the great, unresolved question that hangs over the entire case. After she fled Hemlock Hollow, she effectively vanished from the face of the earth. No credible sightings were ever reported. No body was ever found. It's as if she simply dissolved back into the wilderness from which she came. This ambiguity has allowed for endless speculation, fueling the legend for over a century. One theory is that she died in the unforgiving Ozark wilderness, succumbing to starvation or exposure during the harsh winter that followed her escape. Perhaps she fell into one of the region's many sinkholes or caves, her body remaining undiscovered to this day. It would be a fitting end, to be consumed by the same wilderness that she used to hide her crimes. Another, more optimistic theory is that she was eventually caught and brought to justice under a different name, in a different state, for a different crime, her true identity never discovered. Perhaps she is buried in an unmarked grave in a prison cemetery, her terrifying secrets having died with her. But there is a third theory, one that the people of the Ozarks held onto for generations. It is the most chilling possibility of all, the theory that she got away. That she successfully fled, changed her name, and settled in another isolated community, another place full of transient, unmissed men. That the Bone Garden of Hemlock Hollow was not the end of her story, but merely the end of one chapter. The idea that Alara Heston continued her horrifying work elsewhere is not just idle speculation. It is supported by a handful of deeply disturbing, albeit unproven, connections. In the decade following her disappearance, a series of similar vanishings were reported in a remote county in the Arkansas Ozarks, about 200 miles south of Hemlock Hollow. At least 5 itinerant workers disappeared without a trace over a period of 3 years. The local authorities, lacking the grim context of the Missouri case, attributed the disappearances to the dangers of the wilderness and never conducted a serious investigation. Then there is the case of the Lonesome Widow of Bentonville from 1895. An elderly, reclusive woman whose past was a complete mystery was found dead of natural causes in her small, isolated cabin. When authorities cleared out her belongings, they found a small, locked chest. Inside was a collection of men's pocket watches and a single, well-preserved tintype photograph. The photograph was of a much younger woman, tall and gaunt, with cold, haunting eyes. The description of this woman, recorded in the county clerk's notes, bears a striking resemblance to the descriptions of Alara Heston. Was this her? Had she lived out her days in quiet anonymity, her murderous appetites fading with age? Or was this just a coincidence, another lonely woman in a lonely part of the world? The evidence is purely circumstantial, a tantalizing, indeed terrifying thread that can never be definitively tied. But it leaves us with the most disturbing thought of all, that monsters don't always get caught. Sometimes they just get old. The legacy of Alara Heston is not written in history books, but in the landscape and the culture of the Ozarks. To this day, there are places known as Widow's Holler or Heston's Ridge, scattered throughout the region, place names that have become detached from their original, horrifying context, but still carry a faint echo of the fear she inspired. Her story became a boogeyman tale, a story whispered by parents to keep their children from wandering too far into the woods. She merged with older folklore of witches and hags who lived in the deep forest, her real-life horrors lending a terrifying credibility to those ancient myths. The case also had a lasting, tangible effect on the community. For decades after the discovery, outsiders and strangers were treated with an even greater degree of suspicion in that part of the state. The open hospitality of the frontier was replaced by a guarded, fearful caution. Every traveler was a potential victim, and every isolated homesteader was a potential threat. The story of Alara Heston poisoned the well of communal trust. It revealed that the greatest threat was not always from the wilderness or from bandits, but sometimes from the quiet neighbor down the creek, the one who kept to themselves, the one with the cold, watchful eyes. It was a lesson in the terrifying duplicity of human nature, a lesson that the people of Hemlock Hollow would never forget. The curse she left behind was not supernatural. It was the psychological wound of knowing that such evil was possible and that it could be hiding anywhere. Let us now return to that grim day of discovery in 1887. There is one final, macabre detail, one that was so deeply disturbing it was mentioned only in the private journal of Marshall Sutton and nowhere else. It is the climax of this horrifying tale, the revelation that elevates Alara Heston from a mere serial killer into something far more monstrous. After unearthing the bodies in the garden, Sutton and his men conducted a final, more thorough search of the cabin. They were looking for any documents, any letters, anything that might point to where Alara had fled. In a small, cleverly hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of the cabin, they found a small, leather-bound ledger. It was not a diary filled with confessions or tormented thoughts. It was an account book. Page after page was filled with neat, precise entries written in Alara's elegant script. On one side of the page was a list of dates. Next to each date was a brief, chillingly mundane description of a man. Tall man, red beard, prospector's tools. Short man, city clothes, sold tinware. Young man, surveyor, nervous disposition. It was a catalog of her victims, but it was the other side of the page that made Marshal Sutton's blood run cold. On that side were numbers, calculations, meticulous notes on weights and measures, rendering times, yields of fat per body and prices per pound. It was a business ledger. She was running her murder spree like a factory, constantly refining her process for maximum efficiency and profit. The ledger revealed the true, horrifying motive behind the killings. It wasn't just revenge against men who reminded her of her abusive husband. That may have been the spark that started the fire, but it had evolved into something else entirely. It had become a cold, rational, economic enterprise. The ledger contained cost-benefit analyses. She noted which types of men yielded more usable fat. She recorded the fluctuating market price for soap in Springfield and calculated her profit margins. There were even notes on how to improve the scent of the final product to better mask its origin. This was the discovery that broke Marshal Sutton. The teeth in the fireplace, the bodies in the garden. That was the work of a monster, but a comprehensible one. This ledger was different. This was the work of a human mind that had completely severed its connection to morality, a mind that saw other human beings not as people, but as a standing crop to be harvested. The murder was just the first step in a production process. The dismemberment, the boiling, the rendering, it was just labor. The final product, the soap, was just a commodity. This level of dehumanization is the ultimate horror of the Alara Heston case. She wasn't just killing men. She was consuming their very essence, transforming their bodies into an object of commerce, and then using the profits to continue her cycle of death. It is a form of evil so profound and so complete that it defies all explanation. Among the chilling entries in the ledger, one page stood out. It was dedicated to her husband, Jebediah. The entry was dated the night of the fire. It was the first entry in the book. It detailed the amount of kerosene used, the approximate burn time of the cabin, and then a horrifying calculation, an estimate of the amount of product lost in the blaze. She wasn't just his killer, she was furious about the waste. Jebediah was meant to be her first experiment, the prototype for her Macabre business. His accidental immolation was not a tragedy, but a costly operational failure. This revelation reframes the entire story. The fire was not a desperate act of a battered wife fighting back. It was a calculated, albeit botched, attempt to launch her enterprise. Her period of grieving, her quiet rebuilding of the cabin, it was all a performance. In reality, she was retooling, learning from her mistakes and preparing to begin again, this time with more efficiency. This detail, more than any other, reveals the true depth of her psychopathy. There was no emotion involved, no rage, no fear, no grief. There was only the cold, dispassionate logic of a predator. Her husband's death was not an act of liberation that unlocked a hidden darkness. It was the failed first step in a business plan. The human cost was never a factor in her equations. She was the ultimate capitalist of carnage, a pioneer of a horrifying industry where the only raw material was human life. The existence of this ledger explains the official silence, the banning of this story from history, more than anything else. A story about a vengeful widow killing men could be understood, even sensationalized. But the story of a woman who creates a business model based on the systematic murder and processing of human beings into a consumer good was an idea too dangerous, too corrosive to the very foundations of society. It suggests a potential for human evil that is bottomless, a capacity for methodical, rational monstrosity that is far more terrifying than any crime of passion. The authorities in 1887 likely made a calculated decision. To release the full details of the ledger would be to unleash a kind of conceptual terror upon the public, an idea so vile it could cause mass panic and social breakdown. So they buried it. Marshall Sutton kept his journal private. The ledger itself disappeared, likely destroyed, its horrifying contents deemed too dark for human eyes. They simplified the narrative, turning Alara into a common murderer on the run, a comprehensible villain. They erase the part of the story where she becomes a symbol of something much worse, the complete and utter collapse of humanity into a system of predatory economics. The truth was not just banned, it was deemed a threat to civilization itself. It is only through the faint, surviving whispers that we can piece together this ultimate, horrifying truth. The story of Alara Heston forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil. We often imagine monsters as being chaotic, driven by uncontrollable urges and madness. But Alara's case presents a different, more chilling archetype, the monster as a rational, meticulous planner, the monster as an entrepreneur. Her actions were not random, they were systematic. Her cabin was not a lair, it was a factory. Her victims were not targets of rage, they were inventory. This cold, calculating approach is what makes her so terrifying. She represents the terrifying intersection of psychopathy and industriousness. In a different life, a woman with her intelligence, patience, and meticulous planning might have run a successful farm or a thriving small business. But her internal moral compass was not just broken, it was entirely absent. And so she applied those same skills to an industry of her own invention, one built on murder and desecration. It is a stark reminder that the most dangerous monsters are not always the ones who scream and rage. Sometimes, they are the ones who are quiet, patient, and keep detailed, immaculate records of their atrocities. They are the ones who look at a fellow human being and see not a soul, but a resource to be exploited, a problem of logistics to be solved. And that kind of evil can be very, very difficult to spot until it is far too late. Could a story like this be true? While the tale of Alara Heston as presented here is a dramatization built upon the bones of Ozark folklore, it is frighteningly plausible. History is rife with real-life monsters who turned murder into a business. H. Holmes and his infamous Murder Castle in Chicago during the same era, where he defrauded and murdered guests, selling their skeletons to medical schools. The loneliest killers, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck, who bilked and murdered lonely widows in the 1940s. And most infamously, the legends of figures like Sweeney Todd, the demon barber who turned his victims into meat pies, a piece of folklore that taps into the same deep-seated fear of consumption and predatory capitalism. The most terrifying part of the widow of Black Creek is that she, or someone like her, could have existed. In the vast, unpoliced expanses of 19th-century America, with countless transient workers and isolated homesteads, a predator as cunning and methodical as Alara Heston could have operated for years without detection. The resources and communication needed for law enforcement to track such a killer simply did not exist. How many other Alara Hestons were out there, their bone gardens never discovered, their horrifying ledgers never found? How many of their victims were simply recorded as another soul lost to the unforgiving frontier? The story is a chilling thought experiment, a glimpse into a darkness that was not only possible but probable in the forgotten corners of history. In the end, the story of Alara Heston is not just about a single, monstrous woman. It is about a time and a place that could allow such a monster to flourish. The isolation of the Ozarks, the deep-seated suspicion of outsiders, the lack of centralized law enforcement, and the abundance of vulnerable, transient men. All these factors created the perfect ecosystem for a predator like her to thrive. She was a product of her environment, a twisted manifestation of the harsh, unforgiving nature of the frontier. Her cabin was a dark reflection of the homesteading dream, a perversion of the ideal of self-sufficiency. She was self-sufficient, but her independence was fueled by the lives of others. The story is a macabre parable about the darkness that can fester when isolation and depravity are allowed to intertwine. It serves as a permanent, chilling stain on the history of the region, a reminder that beneath the stunning natural beauty of the Ozark Hills lies the capacity for the most profound and disturbing human horrors. The creek still flows, the hollows still fill with fog, and the whispers of the widow who boiled strangers alive still echo in the deep, dark woods for anyone who is brave or foolish enough to listen. The fate of Hemlock Hollow itself provides a haunting final chapter to this story. The town never recovered. The notoriety of the Bone Garden case turned it into a place of morbid curiosity, and then a place to be avoided at all costs. The community, already insular, drew even further into itself. Families began to move away, unable to live with the constant, invisible presence of the horror that had occurred there. The land was seen as tainted, cursed. Within a generation, Hemlock Hollow had become a ghost town. The general store collapsed, the church fell into ruin, and the forest began to reclaim the land. Today, nothing remains of it but a few crumbling stone foundations and a small, overgrown cemetery where the unearthed victims of Alara Heston lie in their mass grave. The town itself became one of her final victims, its heart ripped out by the sheer horror of her crimes. It was effectively erased from the map, a community so traumatized that it simply ceased to exist, its name and its story absorbed into the larger, darker legend of the Widow of Black Creek. The physical place is gone, but the psychic scar remains, a testament to how one person's profound evil can not only destroy lives, but can kill an entire community, leaving nothing behind but a forbidden, horrifying memory. The disturbing mystery of Alara Heston is, ultimately, a story without an ending. The lack of resolution is precisely what makes it so haunting. We don't know where she went. We don't know if she killed again. We don't know if she died peacefully in her bed as an old woman, or if she met a violent end in the wilderness. This gaping void in the narrative is where our deepest fears reside. The monster was never punished. The evil was never contained. It was simply unleashed, and then it walked away, fading into the mists of history, free to continue its work. This is the truth behind so many dark histories that have been banned or suppressed. They don't offer the comforting closure of justice. They present us with the terrifying reality that evil is not always defeated, that monsters sometimes win, and that the universe is not obligated to provide us with a satisfying conclusion. The story of the widow who boiled strangers alive is a permanent, festering wound in the historical narrative, a cold case that will never be solved. And so she remains at large, not in the physical world, but in the realm of our darkest imaginations. A perpetual ghost on the American frontier, a symbol of the terrifying, methodical evil that can hide behind a quiet face, in a lonely cabin, just down the bend of a dark and silent creek.